All right, guys and gals, we're going to be continuing on with our study of the Civil War, and we're going to be looking at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Remember, the last battle that we ended off with was the Battle of Antietam, which was the bloodiest battle in one day that we saw during the Civil War. Fredericksburg looks a little bit different at this point in time. The Union are basically trying to infiltrate the South. You're going to have General Burnside, who is going to be going up against General Lee of the Confederacy. And what ends up going to happening is General Burnside is going to get overzealous and overconfident and try to march his troops into Richmond, Virginia, which at the point in time during the Civil War, Richmond, Virginia was the capital of the Confederacy. Again, very interesting fact is if you look at if you ever go to Arlington Cemetery, at the top of Arlington Cemetery is General Lee's mansion where he lived. On his mansion, you have a clear view of not only Washington, D.C., but a clear view of Richmond, Virginia. They were adjacent to one another and in very close proximity of each other. So, very interesting to say that both capitals were so close to each other that you could have, in a sense, thrown a rock over to the other one. But again, General Burnside is going to try to attack Richmond, Virginia. And to do that, he had to basically go across the river to do so. So, let me see. We'll go to the next slide. Oh. General Burnside wanted to take the Confederacy capital of Richmond, Virginia. He had to go around the Rappahannock River into Fredericksburg, but it would mean that his flanks were open to attack by General Jackson in Richmond, Virginia, and what ends up happening is basically he becomes vulnerable on the flanks and is so in tune with just trying to take Richmond and Virginia up the strait. He overlooks the fact that Jackson, an incredible general that he was, and an incredible cavalry member as he was, would easily basically take Burnside off on his flanks, and he was not going to be able to get the reinforcements and supplies needed to basically combat that battle. So the Confederates end up winning. Basically, it was an absolute disaster for Burnside. Lee was able to take the high grounds of Mary Heights, which basically overlooks Fredericksburg, and we talked about this in the last battles that we discussed. Having the vantage point or the high point is going to be pivotal in any battle, especially when we get to talking about Gettysburg. If you're able to have the vantage point, you'll be able to see, number one, where your enemy is going. Number two, your cannons that are most likely placed up there, your mortars, can easily shoot down on the enemy, creating holes and gaps into the enemy, and eventually either taking them out up the middle or even on the flanks. So Burnside is basically overpowered by Lee's amazing tactics, and his overconfidence basically goes to show you that he was not the great general that he thought he was. So when we look at the casualties, they're quite close if you look at percentage-wise. Union are going to lose around almost 1,300 men. 9,600 men are wounded. About almost 1,800 men are captured. Confederacy with completely outnumbered. If you look at that number, 5,377 compared to the Union's 12,653. 608 people would die within the Confederate Army. Around 4,000 would be wounded and 653 would be captured. So not huge casualty loss here if you think about the battle itself. But again, when you are outnumbering an enemy, you should be winning. So when we look at the actual battle itself, this is where Burnside basically takes it up. He comes around the Rappahannock River, going straight forward into Lee's army, which is not the brightest thing in the world. He has Franklin and Burns on the right flank and basically trying to overrun. The left flank, overrunning the left side of Lee's military. And again, he's stopped by the amazing Jackson. And right here, what we can say is why this ends up happening is because he has the vantage point. If Burnside sends Hooker and Sumner up the middle, they are completely going uphill against Longstreet, McLaws and Ransom's Lee was well as with Pickett and Hood. They're going up a hill, met by mortar fire, met by the Confederate army. So in a sense, they're basically being shot like a fish in fish in a bucket, okay, or fish in a barrel. So unfortunately, because they try to overpower the center, they're looked to have to hook around and retreat. Same thing happens with Franklin. They try to push forward against Jackson and the majors under him. And again, they are met with cannon fire, mortar fire, and the Confederate army and have to turn away and retreat. So pretty terrible defeat when it comes to the Union there. The last battle that we're going to be talking about today is a very important battle in the history, which is Chancellorsville. Okay. I would disregard the numbers here because there's no way Joseph Hooker's Union Army had 133,000 men. So I will go ahead and check that. So disregard that as well. But we need to know here is Hooker was going against Lee, and it was in Spotsylvania, Virginia. The main thing about Chancellorsville is it was actually a surprise attack by the Confederate Army. They end up surprising the Union Army in the morning, and they basically bombard the Union forces under Hooker and Pope, and many of them run all the way back to what you would consider the main fortress or the command center of Hooker, where basically Hooker yells at them and tells them to hold their ground and fight back against Lee and Jackson's army. At that point in time, they are at a standstill. This is probably the only time that Jackson and Lee actually get in a tiff with one another. Jackson wants to continue the attack on Hooker and basically, in a sense, hopefully end or at least sway the war in the favor of the Confederacy. He finds it that because they have them on the back heel, meaning because Jackson and Lee have Hooker and Pope on the back heel, that they'll be able to crush the military right then and there. Lee kind of disregards this and plays more of a hesitation game and calls the attack off. And because of this, what ends up happening is in the evening time, Jackson and some of his men end up going out and kind of trying to find where they're going to be able to bust a hole in Hooker's army or Hooker's fleet of soldiers. But as he is venturing back into quote-unquote Confederate grounds, he's shot by his own soldier in friendly fire. What ends up happening is, especially during nighttime, it's not like they necessarily have these bright color outfits. The Confederates are in gray, so it's really hard to decipher who is whom when you're shooting and fighting, especially in the dark. So Jackson's actually looking to go back into his territory. He is fired upon through friendly fire by their soldiers. He's basically hit in the gut. Falls to the ground. His men basically cover him back over. They tell them, we're friendlies, don't fire. They take, Jackson back to their grounds that they're fighting on, their territory, and he ends up dying there. Now, this is the biggest turning point of the war, because many historians believe that if Jackson survives this or is not shot and killed in Chancellorsville by friendly fire, Gettysburg could have looked very differently. And Gettysburg comes kind of quickly after Chancellorsville, and not only are the morale of his men, down because they just lost, the General Lee just lost his right-hand man. After this, Lee doesn't really trust anyone else. I guess you could say this second man would be Longstreet. But beyond that, he has very minimal trust in his generals besides Jackson, and finds many of them to be, in his words, kind of idiots. So this is a huge loss for the Confederate soldiers. The Union was defeated, but again, this ends up becoming a bigger loss for the Confederates because they lose their man, Stonewall Jackson. All right, guys, we'll stop here. Again, disregard these numbers up top. I'll get you the correct numbers uh, in the actual notes as well, so you guys can jot those down. I'll talk to you guys soon, and we'll go over the next battles on Wednesday.